If you're from the chat function there on the middle right of your screen, you're seeing different folk log in to this webinar. We got a really good crew tonight from 3 countries, Canada, Australia, and the US, and who knows, maybe a few more. At the console tonight is Tim Nafziger, working the Tech Magic. And we also have Adela Barrett with us, who is our fall intern here at BCM. And welcome to all of you, particularly to the several groups who are online, folk in Atlanta, folk in Portland, and there may be some other group viewers, so please let that be known through the chat function. This is going to be a little different tonight, friends. More informal, kind of more old school. We didn't have the fancy lead-in music tonight because I didn't get around to uploading it, and that kind of suggests that we're just going to kind of do some old-fashioned Bible study tonight, and the reason for that is several-fold, and that's what I want to get right into here. Now, some of you are part of churches or traditions that follow the Revised Common Lectionary or some version thereof, Catholic version, Episcopal version, Lutheran version. And these are the texts for this coming Sunday, the 18th Sunday after Pentecost. We don't often take the opportunity of these webinars to follow the lectionary or to anticipate the lectionary, but every once in a while I like to. I know that many of you out there are preachers, and many of us go to church and hear these texts preached. So I thought at least once this year we ought to look at the texts of an upcoming week. And of course, this Sunday seemed to be a great opportunity. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to look at the gospel text for this coming Sunday. And before we turn to the gospel, there are some pretty powerful Hebrew Bible lections as part of this Sunday's reading. For example, Jeremiah 8 is one of the many laments that we find in the prophet Jeremiah, particularly in this case, a lament about the poor of Israel. You see the line, the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. It means it wasn't a good harvest, or maybe it means that the elites took all the food and left none for the poor. Jeremiah is literally bursting with tears because he's watching the poor die. This is underlined by another prophetic reading this Sunday from Amos 8, and that's perhaps a more well-known text to many of us, in which the prophet warns the wealthy elites in Israel, exposing their presumption of how they basically see poor people as human beings exploit for the sake of market profit. And this tradition of how dare you sell the poor for a pair of sandals, that is, how dare you put commodities over human life, is one that many of us have used in our social justice work. These two prophetic voices suggest that this Sunday in church, should we venture forth, there will be some talk about economic justice. In fact, that's underlined by the concluding verse to the gospel lection, Luke 16:13, which is one of Jesus' most unequivocal statements of the incompatibility between God and the mammon system. As Clarence Jordan famously put it, Jesus didn't say we shouldn't serve God and mammon, he said we can't. So with all these powerful texts, we would hope that the 22nd of September would be a virtual festival of economic justice in our churches. However, the realistic part of ours hearts and minds suggest that that probably will not be the case. And there are so many reasons why that won't be the case, not least of which is, as John Hoey famously put it, we tend to read the Bible as if we didn't handle money, and we tend to handle our money as if there were no Bible. In other words, there's this huge gulf between our liturgical and exegetical handling of Scripture and how we actually live our lives. Obviously, a big part of the mission of BCM is to try to overcome that endemic problem in our churches. And so tonight we're going to gather around in a virtual Bible study across North America and beyond to try to both prevent and prepare for this sad deficiency in our churches by having a little webinar study group. And I want to share with you a piece that I've really been working with in lots of different contexts. A few of you, I think, tonight on the webinar have perhaps heard this piece in some version before. I've been working it for a while. I published it last year in a Festschrift, a celebratory anthology for Professor Christopher Rowland of Oxford. Chris Rowland, I want to take a moment to make sure that all of you on the webinar tonight know of the work of this man. He is truly one of the faithful scholars, one of the scribes for the kingdom. Been surviving at Oxford in England for decades. He is the foremost scholar of radical Christianity, both the theology of radical Christianity, the biblical interpretive tradition of radical Christianity, and above all, the history of radical Christianity from the beginnings of the Jesus movement right up to the present. Chris Rowland is a beautiful human being. He's a faithful disciple, and he's a world-class scholar. So I was really honored to be able to offer a chapter in this Festschrift where students honor their teachers. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to delve into the gospel reading for this Sunday in Luke 16. And this is kind of the plan. I'm going to focus on what most churches this Sunday will try to avoid or sentimentalize or spiritualize. Jesus' remarkable and perplexing parable of the so-called unjust steward. To make sense of this parable, we're going to do a bit of social analysis first, and then after reading the parable, we're going to discuss some possible practices that might flow from our reading. It has, for a long time, struck me that this rather odd parable is uniquely relevant to our first world context as generally educated, generally middle class, certainly from a global perspective, affluent people. So that's our plan. That's what we're going to do, and thank you so much for for joining us. Now, as we saw briefly, the prophetic readings from this coming Sunday's lections of Jeremiah and Amos really draw our attention sharply to the always and ever inconvenient truth of wealth disparity in our world. This disparity is ubiquitous, it's persistent, and it threatens both the very foundations of our faith, personally, and the very study of the political systems that we inhabit. But of course, there are huge silences around wealth and poverty in our households, in our communities and churches, and certainly in the public conversation, as we saw in the last presidential election. You would have thought there were no rich and poor in America to listen to the national politicians chase votes. So what we want to do tonight is offer a sort of little in-house reflection on what we think is one of the most, if not the most, basic discipleship dilemma facing folk like us. And that is, how do we follow Jesus in an economic culture that is unsustainable, unjust, and utterly hostile to the vision of what we here call Sabbath economics? Now, I think most of you on the webinar know that the question of Sabbath economics and the household covenant is one of the most basic disciplines around which we try to shape our work, both personally and politically here at BCM. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that Jonathan Cornford is on the webinar tonight from Australia, and Jonathan has done a magnificent job adapting the sevenfold household practices covenant and Sabbath economics theology in general to his context down in Australia and among churches and radical discipleship communities down there. And Jonathan, it's really great to have you on tonight. But, you know, part of the dilemma is that even as we try to work diligently at this household covenant, at these disciplines, we're keenly aware that we are up to our necks in what Dorothy Day called the filthy, rotten system. Every day we use fossil fuels that we know are killing the planet. Every day we handle money that is part of financial networks that make rich people rich and poor people poor. And every day we wear clothes, eat food, and use technology that are deeply complicit in the pillaging of both nature and the poor. No matter how diligent we are all compromised because of the ubiquitous nature of the system that we live in. So we want to try to get at that, and to do that, it's good to just feel feel the frustrations when we think of the macro realities. When we see the macro realities around us, we understand that they're not simple, and they certainly can't be treated with sound bites, not in church, not in the public square. Of course, there's a danger in overemphasizing that complexity. And that danger is that regular folk like us, regular citizens and disciples, can easily become overwhelmed and disempowered, feeling as though we are mere spectators in a cosmic drama that we can neither comprehend nor engage. And that is indeed the perception of most folk in our churches and in our neighborhoods. And that's why the economic and ecological pillaging continue relatively unchecked. In other words, in the midst of current debates and all of these vast realities, it's really easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees. And I like this image because I always think of the church as sort of looking on to this market juggernaut as it tears a hole in the world. And we're trying to call 911 or hope that God's going to do something, but we, for the most part, feel confused. So I think that's real. Now, many of us would say it even more strongly. We would say that the crisis we're facing is far deeper than the public conversation allows for. The crisis we face is civilizational, nothing less. And mere policy tinkering or reform around the edges really isn't going to change anything. I think that's true, and it's kind of a depressing fact. And yet, the inconvenient truth of our civilizational crisis does represent an evangelical opening. At least that's how the great Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall liked to put it. Theology, he said, begins with the experience of disillusionment. And if we are not disillusioned with the economic and social system of which we're a part, then we're probably not paying attention. He wrote in 1989, Hall, if the disciple community were willing and able to cease lending our support to the modern illusion, if instead we were to concentrate our considerable powers of analysis and understanding upon the experience of a society which has become disillusioned with the promises of modernity, then I believe truly creative theology could occur in our context, and that is what is sorely needed. That's a pretty impressive way of stating things, and thank God for this great Canadian theologian. He talks about this as an evangelical opening for the church, and I believe that is true. And even having said that, global economic realities are difficult and they're complicated. If we are to try to engage them, we're going to have to remind ourselves that there is a time to make complicated things simple. Not simplistic, as in the economic fairy tales that we get from politicians and from the media, but intelligible enough to inspire what Paulo Freire famously called cultural action for transformation. That is the vocation of popular education, which many of you on the webinar tonight are practitioners of. So all that is to say that amidst the current economic obfuscations trumpeted by the priests of high capitalism, we Christians really need to practice the Quaker discipline of speaking plainly about this dilemma. Now, as many of you have heard me say before, this is one of my favorite quotes from journalist William Grider, because it struck me so much almost 10 years ago when he came out with his book, The Soul of Capitalism, in which he talks about the house of economics being due for a major renovation, if not a complete teardown, where he diagnosed capitalism as essentially encouraging human pathologies and embodying irresponsibility as a central requirement. What he means by that, of course, is that economic growth demands more production and consumption. That is fundamentally unsustainable, so we're painting ourselves into a corner. And then he concludes his analysis, and this is no Marxist or radical Occupy person. This is a pretty mainstream economist. Grider says, above all, what we need is a new narrative of the economy. We need a new story. And that really got my theological attention, and I hope gets yours. So what I want to do is really approach our Economic Justice Sunday coming up by looking a little more at the economic story to which we're captive, the dominant story that's killing us. In order to do this, and in order to both diagnose and deconstruct this dominant story, we're going to have to go a little deeper. And I find that one of the disciplines that's really important in helping us do that is a relatively new field called economic anthropology. And what I want to do is look at the work of four people who could reasonably said to inhabit the intellectual stream of economic anthropology. That is just trying to look at the system that we're in the middle of from an anthropological perspective, to look at its logic, its dysfunction, its contradictions. So I want to briefly look at four theorists. One is the German psychologist Ferdinand Tönnies. He was one of many late 19th century socialists who was trying to make sense of the world change that was happening around him in Northern Europe, wrought by industrialization and urbanization. Modern capitalism really achieved hegemony in the North Atlantic world, both Europe and North America, by the late 19th century. And this resulted, of course, in massive and unprecedented social displacement and environmental destruction. Whole landscapes disappeared, whole populations were moved around the map. And European and, to some extent, North American intellectuals were trying to understand this brave new world. Of course, the most famous of these sociologists was Karl Marx. Max Weber was another. But I like Tenney's way of articulating the. In his 1887 book, he made a basic distinction, which I like to invoke, between two powerful forces which were essentially battling for the hearts and minds and real landscapes and materiality of the world. One force was what he called the integrating force of Gemeinschaft, or community. And by this he meant things like kinship, ethnicity, religion, even local identity. And the major competitor to Gemeinschaft, according to Tenney's, was the brave new world of Gesellschaft, or capitalist society. Now, he defined Gemeinschaft as everything that holds human relationships together despite all the forces that would pull them apart. Conversely, Gesellschaft represented everything that was pulling human relationships apart, despite the organic sinews that hold people together. And Tenney saw that the modern market economy and the state apparati that were developed to facilitate it were steadily unraveling the fabric of older, more traditional ways of being human and being social. He saw that relationality, including practices of economic exchange, were falling by the wayside under the pressure of market forces. Now, to try to, that may seem a little abstract, and so to try to put it into focus, let's use an analogy to try to keep things simple enough to grapple with. Daniel Kemmis, who is an important bioregional theorist and practitioner, in a book called Community and the Politics of Place, described the difference between Tenney's Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft as the difference between, on one hand, a place-centered market, which offers nurture and support and relationship and for locally owned enterprises. So, for example, a farmer's market, and our brilliant photographer Tim Nafsinger recently took this picture of Central Market in Lancaster, about which he has fond memories growing up. So the difference between a marketplace in the true sense of the term, where people are in relationship with each other and with the things they're buying and selling, versus what Daniel Kemmis calls a placeless market. That is an abstract, totally relationless kind of thing. So we might symbolize that by the phenomenon of online shopping, right? Both of these sites of exchange are economic spheres, farmers market and online shopping. But in a farmers market, social relations are still paramount. They still matter. In fact, they matter the most. While when it comes to online shopping, social relationships have been completely erased in favor of mass production, mass distribution, and mass consumption. I think that not unfairly summarizes what Tenney's was trying to get at. Now, Tenney's was not alone in trying to articulate this. Another great Eastern European philosopher, Karl Polanyi, made a similar distinction. His 1944 watershed work, The Great Transformation, The Political and Economic Origins of Our Times, traces how market society has relentlessly displaced other kinds of redistributive and reciprocative social orders that have characterized human history right up into the present. Polanyi argued that modernity was defined fundamentally by the forces of the self-regulated market and what he called all the different counter movements of social protectionism, meaning all of the ways in which human beings still try to be economic together in a way that protects and preserves social relationships. Now, imagine naming this in 1944. It's so prescient, it's so prophetic even. To bring us a little bit more into the modern sphere, a third economic anthropologist I would cite would be the ecological and feminist economist Hazel Henderson, who really summarizes the points that Tenney's and Polanyi are making, but adds into that the problem of our relationship with nature. So her well-known model of the economic cake argues that most economic calculations of net worth, such as the GNP, or what's called today the GDP, the gross domestic product, in a capitalist economy, give monetary value only to private and public sector goods and services. And so in the cake here, you see the frosting on the cake is the private sector and the purple level as the public sector. So that's what gets counted in the calculations of GDP. And I think we're all pretty aware that calculations of GDP are crucial to the rise and fall of markets and economic development schemes, indeed foreign policies. But Hazel Henderson says that's not counting more than half of the economic cake. What is invisible is the underground economy, right? The informal economy, like drug dealing or to some extent under the table markets, which are only counted indirectly through taxation, the economy of undocumented people. What is not counted at all in the way GDPs are figured is what Hazel Henderson called the social cooperative economy and nature herself. What she argues is that what she called the love economy, which is every time human beings help each other out because they're in relationship, every time someone gives a gift, every time someone makes a meal, every time someone offers hospitality or neighbors help fix the porch or somebody gives you advice on how to fix your car, that's an economic kind of transaction, but it doesn't count because it's the gift economy, it's the love economy. Now, Hazel Henderson makes 2 points about the love economy. One, she says, is if we were to calculate the monetary worth of the love economy, she argues it would be at least as big as the top 3 layers of this cake. So we're discounting half the economic value of the cake because it doesn't go through market forces. The second thing she points out is that the love economy is disproportionately inhabited by women. And then she also makes the same point about nature. And this was 20 years ago. Today there's a whole field of ecological accounting in which people are trying to figure out what nature does for free, what the market value of that would be. But still doesn't count in GDPs, right? So forests are only valued in terms of board feet, not in terms of ozone cleansing. Water is only valued for water markets, not for ways in which they keep all life alive. And so on. Sorry, my little setup just fell. Sorry about that. So this is one way, and I think a good and important way of making a complicated thing simple. This notion of a cake. It's a beautiful exercise in popular education. To assert, as Hazel Henderson does, that the possibility of any future sustainability and justice must begin by revaluing the entire cake, beginning from the bottom up. Finally, the person that probably most of us on this webinar are familiar with, who sort of echoes Tenney's and Polanyi and Hazel Henderson, is Wendell Berry. And he has sort of made popular Wes Jackson's suggestion that the New Testament notion of the kingdom of God really is best understood in terms of the notion of the great economy. We seek, says Wendell Berry, the kingdom of God in part by our economic behavior, and we fail to find it if that behavior is wrong. The human economy, if it is to be a good economy, must fit harmoniously in and must correspond to the great economy. And this is one of the central ideas of Wendell Berry's writing, the notion that there are essentially two economies. On one hand, there is what he calls the great economy, which he identifies with nature. It is characterized by abundance, by gift, commonwealth, circulation, equity, interdependence, sharing, release, limits. And the human economy, or what Wendell Berry prefers to call the little economy, tends to be characterized by scarcity, possession, concentration, stratification, autonomy, privatization, debt, and exhaustion. The problem, says Wendell Berry, of our industrial order with its penchant for control and its lack of limits is that it doesn't see itself as a little economy, it sees itself as the only economy. It thus makes itself exclusive, or it makes itself exclusive by the simple expedient of valuing only what it can use. That is, what it can regard as raw material to be transformed mechanically into something else. The industrial economy, says Wendell Berry, is based on the invasion and pillage of the great economy. The human economy, by using up such goods as topsoil, fossil fuel, fossil water, incurs a debt to the future that we are increasingly becoming unable to repay. And so what we call use, the future will call theft. And that's why it's no surprise that our corporations are so frequently in court and robbery is on the increase. So I think many of you are familiar with Wendell Berry's analysis, but both Hazel Henderson and Wendell Berry, as more modern theorists, are really reiterating the basic conundrum outlined by Tenney's and Polanyi. And so that leads me to offer a way of making the complicated things simple. Remember, economics is very complicated. We feel intimidated by it. If we don't have a PhD in economics or know how to read the Wall Street Journal, we feel pretty disempowered. And yet all of us participate in economic activity. So here would be my attempt to sort of summarize what these theorists are saying. To use William Greider's call for a new story, what is flawed about the dominant economic and ecological story is that it has slowly but surely transformed economics and economic exchange into something that was supposed to serve social and ecological relationships, into something that now demands the sacrifice of those social and ecological relationships. Capital has now replaced community as the center of our economic story. And that trend threatens to destroy all social and ecological relations. It is unsustainable and it must be stopped and reversed. That really is our discipleship dilemma, both personally and politically. Now, obviously, this is a broad generalization, and probably nobody's going to be talking about it this Sunday in church. But I find it, as someone who struggles with the work of popular education, I find it a useful focalizer for the theological and practical work we need to do in our churches and beyond. And if that is true, if that's what is flawed about our economic story, then our task as people of faith in this historical moment is to give absolute priority to the ongoing struggle to recover, nurture, and advocate for community in the midst of the ever more insatiable power of capital. And that is exactly what Jesus' parable of the defective steward means to address. And that brings us to our text. So that's the social analysis part of our program. If you have Bibles, you might want to unravel them to Luke 16. Just as we would look at a social issue in a wider context, it's important to look at a given text like a parable in its literary context. Luke uses many parables to address the social crisis of wealth and poverty. We're going to look at just one of them. We had a great time at the Bartimaeus Institute earlier this year in February looking at a whole raft of Lucan stories and teachings about the crisis of wealth and poverty. But here is the parable in its context in Luke 16. This is the text where the parable, and you see it begins with the phrase, "There was a rich man who." That's what I am calling the story of the defective manager. It is followed by this infamous teaching on God and mammon, one of the great texts of terror in our New Testament. That is followed by a counterattack by the local authorities who Luke characterizes as lovers of money. And Luke 16 then concludes with a second parable, which begins with the identical phrase, "There was a rich man who." And that, of course, is the story of Lazarus and Dives. So you can see there's a rather simple but elegant structure in the whole of Luke 16. And it's important to keep that in mind, that the whole freights even more meaning than any of the parts, particularly the relationship between the first parable and the last parable. Quick word about parables. Most of our churches relentlessly spiritualize them, typically preaching them as earthly stories with heavenly meanings. And so stories about landless peasants or rich landowners or lepers or lawyers are lifted out of their social and historical context and reshaped into theological or moralistic fables, bereft of any political or economic edge or consequence. But when this social and cultural context that is indigenous to these stories is ignored or suppressed, we are inevitably going to recontextualize that story in terms of our own unconscious political assumptions. And so we sort of impose these theological schemes on the text, which often defy the coherence of the story. And that functions to domesticate the parable under our status quo. So stories that Jesus told in order to challenge our preconceptions instead are used to legitimate them. In so doing, we inevitably disarm the gospel's most powerful rhetorical weapons, parables, whose singular purpose is to rescue us from our domestication under the status quo. So the genius of Jesus' parables were that they narrated recognizable scenarios in plain language that any illiterate peasant could understand. Farming and shepherding, being in debt, doing hard labor. Jesus was, in fact, a popular educator, a social animator, and parables were fundamental to his pedagogy. Contrary then to our traditional spiritualizing treatment, parables aren't earthly stories with heavenly meanings, but what one of my teachers, Bill Herzog, put it, earthy stories with heavy meanings. Some of you, I think, know this book. It's a great treatment of the parables. And I owe a real debt to Bill Herzog. He tries to point out that parables are subversive. They draw the listener in with their familiarity only to throw a surprise twist in order to challenge our assumptions about what is proprietary or what is possible. A miraculous harvest, an enemy as a friend, or an unexpected vindication. So I suppose if I had to look for a modern analogy of parables, I'd think of the kind of stuff that Adbusters does, right? Takes a text that's familiar to us and monkey wrenches it a little bit in order to shock us into a different reading of that familiar image. So we've always got to be attuned to that function of a parable so that we don't immediately sort of trivialize it. So let's look at the parable of the so-called unjust steward. This is a subtitle that many of your Bibles may have. It's already interpreting the parable for you, unhelpfully, I would say. The dominant reading in this text, of course, takes the side of the boss, right? It consciously or unconsciously says, yeah, you know, this steward skimming stuff off, he's a bad guy, and so we side with the boss. Well, of course, that's an unconscious reproduction of capitalist consciousness, and it renders the parable incoherent because this steward, this manager, actually screws up the system and then is commended for it, not only by the befuddled landowner himself, but also by Jesus, the teller of the story. That's why I've renamed the text the story of the defective manager, interpreting him as someone who is profoundly caught between two economies. So let's think of the analogy. A middle manager in a large corporation who, just before he's about to get downsized because of below expected sale numbers, improvises an act of creative resistance that will reposition him toward an alternative relational economy which survives just below the surface of the market system. So I want to propose a reading of this parable that sees the defective manager as the hero, archetype for all of us who are inevitably ensnared in a toxic and oppressive economic system. He manages to use capital to rebuild social relations enough that he has an alternative to his dilemma. So here's the structure. He's charged with wrongdoing. Then there's an internal dialogue that he has about his dilemma. Verse 3. In verse 4, he comes to the conclusion of what he's going to do. He then does that thing. He takes action by writing off a bunch of debt. And the parable proper concludes with the original protagonist or antagonist, depending on how you read the story, the rich man, and his response. So that's kind of the structure of the story. This rhetorical composition functions to focus our attention to the middle, like a fulcrum on which the story balances. That's verse 4, and that is, in fact, the moral of the story. There was a certain plusios, rich man, who had a certain manager, oikonomon. Now, this story begins with a very matter-of-fact acknowledgement that the world is ruled by an absentee landlord class. The wealth of this state is vast, as implied later on in the story by the amounts of wheat and oil that are owed by the rich man's debtors, which in fact are so high that they suggest that entire villages were in debt. As you know, the Greek term oikonomon, from which is related the term oikonomia, from which we get our term economics, means manager of the household. Somewhat like a modern corporation, in antiquity, large landowners didn't run their daily business. Instead, they had managers or retainers, as it's called sociologically. They were part of an elite, literate, bureaucratic class, but oftentimes made up of slaves. So this slave class existed under the rule of the landowner. It was a very cutthroat and tenuous existence. These retainers had to ensure a profit for the master. They had to take a cut for themselves, because that's essentially how they got paid. And they had to do all of this without making the peasants so dry that they would be unable to actually produce the wealth that the rich man was extracting. So we might think of these retainers as contemporary mortgage brokers, maybe. This manager in the story is endlessly caught between the crossfire of the manager's greed on one hand and the excessive complaints of the peasants or the tenant farmers on the other. And that's where we can find a point of contact as modern, middle-class, educated folk. Like the oikos of old, we are essentially privileged people. And yet we are also subservient to an economic system that both benefits and victimizes us, dehumanizes us. And this is a really unique parable because, of course, most of Jesus' parables have peasants as their subject, as the hero of the story. Really, this is one of the few times in which one of these retainers is the focus of the story. So the plot gets going with charges being brought to the rich man about his retainer squandering his goods. The two verbs here tell an interesting story. The first one connotes accusations made with false intent or hostile intent, perhaps slander. The implication here is that other managers are trying to backstab this one in order to take his place in the hierarchy. It's been a very likely scenario. The second verb, diascorpizon, to squander, is actually normally translated to scatter in the New Testament. Only here and in the preceding parable of the prodigal son is it translated to squander, doubtlessly thanks to capitalist hermeneutics. There's very good reason in the context of this parable, however, to argue that this manager, this oikonomos, is already doing some skimming and perhaps already redistributing some of the possessions under his control, a practice that he will shortly intensify. It's surely relevant that earlier in Luke's narrative, this verb diascorpizo appears in a key phrase of Mary's Magnificat. The proud are scattered and the mighty put down from their thrones. Well, this is perhaps a reference to the very demise of rich landowners, such as the one in this parable. Now, though the accusations are hearsay, the manager's dismissal is summary by the rich man. This confirms the landowner's absolute authority. The retainer doesn't try to argue his case or defend himself. He knows there's no due process in this system. He's out on his ear. What we get instead is this very poignant internal dialogue in verse 3. He asks himself, he looks at his alternatives. He realizes he's never going to work in this town again. This soft-handed bureaucrat realizes he's not physically able to do the work of a day laborer, but to beg on the street, to seek alms, would obliterate what remains of his marginal social status as a bureaucrat. So Bill Herzog rightly characterizes his choice as death by digging or death by begging. As suggested by the internal structure of the parable that we just looked at, the story now turns on this manager's conclusion. This is the light bulb that comes on in the story. In verse 4, though his action plan is not yet revealed, the hoped for result is. He's going to do whatever it takes to cross over from the economy of Gesellschaft, the rich man's world, to the economy of Gemeinschaft, that of social relations and hospitality. He is going to defect from the world of the patron, in which all social relations are cannibalized in order to reap profit for the elite. Instead, he's going to try to scatter more of this wealth in the hopes that he will help rebuild some of the old village ethos of mutual aid and hospitality, so that they will receive me into their oikus, their houses, their homes, when I am dismissed from the oikonomia. He's about to get kicked out of the great household, and he now is hoping that home economics will help him survive. There's all sorts of layers of interesting irony in this strategy. Well, the rest of the story unfolds very quickly, revealing his subversive initiative, presumably having a narrow window of time between his firing and the public announcement by the rich man to the tenants of his firing. He hurries to his place of business and, still acting as the master's agent, summons his clients one by one, perhaps so they can't compare notes. "Tell me how much you owe," he says, indicating that he doesn't seem to have the paper, or perhaps he's already crossing over into the old honor code. He does, interestingly, however, ask for their mark or their handwriting on the revised bill. Bill Herzog suggests that the amount that he is writing down on these debts represents roughly the 25 to 50% of the hidden interest charged in produce contracts by rich landowners. So in other words, he's writing off the master's profit margin. Also interestingly, there are only 2 examples narrated here, which kind of opposes the traditional folk-telling parabolic rule of 3. First guy walks into a bar, second guy walks into a bar, third guy walks into a bar, punchline. Here, there are only 2 scenes because this scene isn't the punchline. That's going to come in the master's response. Well, obviously, from a Sabbath economics perspective, we would say that what's going on here in this fire sale on debt is a sort of an ad hoc jubilee moment in which this guy is reaching back into that old tradition of release from debt of Deuteronomy 15, Leviticus 25, and attempting to restore some community as the result of the deconstruction of structural poverty. That was the vision of Sabbath economics in the Hebrew Bible, and that is what he's practically doing, in however small a way. And now comes the punchline, somewhat surprisingly. The master, unaccountably, commends his feral manager, verse 8. Notice that as in the more famous parable of the talents, or parable of the pounds, that we find in Luke 19 and Matthew 25 respectively, here the master concedes that his system is indeed corrupt. He acknowledges this oikonomos as the manager of injustice. Now that's usually translated in our text, the unjust manager. But actually it means literally the manager of injustice. So he understands that the system is rotten, and yet he gives him credit, no pun intended. Shrewd, the Greek term is phronimos, probably alluding to the wisdom of self-preservation that we find in, for example, Proverbs. Now, there's no indication in the story world here that he's not still going to fire the ass of this manager. He's still out on his ear. It seems what is happening here is he's acknowledged that begrudgingly this bureaucrat has outsmarted him. Why? Because here's how this thing would have likely played out. The debtors would have come to the master and praised the master, maybe sent out a press release thanking the rich landowner for being so generous and lauding him publicly. In antiquity, you'd sometimes build a statue to somebody for their generosity. And what's the rich landowner going to do? Is he going to be an asshole and revoke the indebtedness and perhaps cause the entire economic infrastructure to collapse? No, he's kind of stuck with it. So the bureaucrats put him in a hard place, and he's going to have to live with it. That benefits the tenant farmers, or perhaps, as we suggested, entire villages that were in debt. And as far as the poor bureaucrat is concerned, well, He's now at least got a plan B. Well, that's the ending of the parable. Now comes Jesus' assessment, which begins with this phrase: "For the children of this world are shrewder," same verb, "in dealing with their own generation than the children of light." Now, these phrases, this age and their generation, these are kind of apocalyptic phrases, the traditional rhetoric of resistance in Jewish antiquity. It's really meant to indict the entire system of exploitation as part of a world that must be deconstructed. And yet, embedded in this oppositional declaration is Jesus' own acknowledgement that as long as this age persists, shrewdness, that's the rich landowner's verb, will be required to survive it. And this is key. Shrewdness will be required to survive the filthy, rotten system. In this case, the manager has linked his fate to the debtor class, helping them while helping himself. Hard-pressed peasants get a measure of relief, and he'll have a place to stay among the locals. This jubilary gesture has given a partial glimpse of liberation, of jubilee justice. And that brings us to the moral of the story. "So I tell you," says Jesus, "make friends for yourself by means of unjust mammon," or the mammon of injustice. Jesus has told a tale about the rapacious, predatory world of ancient commodity management presided over by the children of this age. And ain't that the truth, friends? We live in a world where it is absolutely ruled over by corporate tycoons and political big dealers and strong men of so many types. And they're smarter than we are, and they're a hell of a lot more rapacious and predatory. They do rule the world. That's one of the depressing, inconvenient truths. And yet, Jesus says the resistance must figure out how to make friends, build social relations within that mammon system. Now, this is the first time that the term mammon is introduced here in Luke. It's a very interesting word. It appears only here in Luke 16 and in its parallel in Matthew 6. It seems to be Jesus' metaphor for the economic system of domination. Because in verse 13, as we'll see, the absolute opposition between mammon and God's kingdom is articulated as an apocalyptic duality at the end of this section. So I believe this rhetoric is Jesus' way of politicizing the issue. In other words, I think he's invoking what Wendell Berry calls the two economies. And he's recognizing that in the real world, we are stuck with the dirty, rotten system. We can imagine that we aren't complicit in it. We can attempt to disentangle from it. But friends, none of us are pure. None of us aren't up to our necks. And we are stuck with it. We are handling money. We are driving cars. We are living in houses in red-line neighborhoods. We got to figure out within that system how to monkey wrench it. So Jesus says, make friends, build social relations by means of the unjust mammon, so that when it fails, not if, when it fails, that mammon system, people may receive you into the eternal tense. Now, notice the echo here of the strategy of the bureaucrat in the parable. It's exact same phrasing. His strategy is so that when it fails for him, he will be received into. This, of course, is the hospitality verb in the New Testament. It's interesting that the Greek word eklipe, to eclipse, that is the only end of the mammon system from the point of view of God. It must be deconstructed. It will come crashing down. In the meantime, we've got to figure how to build social relations. And I love the fact that in Luke 16:9, we aren't just going to be received into oikos, into a home, we're going to be received into eternal tents. Now that's a term that is suggesting a return to Israel's primal wilderness traditions, or maybe the housing of poor folk. Well, Jesus' teaching that concludes this is sort of full of puns. The verb pisteuo, or the adjective pistos, to be trustworthy. It's also the word used for faith in the New Testament, but it's better translated to trust, or to be trustworthy. The only way to be trustworthy is to handle things of true value and not to trust in the things of mammon. This verb is used 5 times in the next 3 verses. The word mammonos in rabbinic writings as an Aramaic term was used by the rabbis to mean that in which someone trusts, usually a little treasure that's stuffed under the bed. And so here the irony is, if you have not been trustworthy in the thing in which you place your trust, mammonas, who will entrust you with true abundance? So that's sort of Jesus asking, putting the question to us. If we can't figure out how to monkey wrench the system for the benefit of that which is of true value, then why would we be entrusted with things of true value? And then, of course, the whole teaching comes to a uncomfortable conclusion with one of the most unequivocal statements in all of Scripture. You cannot serve God and mammon. This is the 2 economies at their starkest contrast. At the end of the day, only one economy matters. But in this day, we are stuck in the little economy, the industrial economy, the economy of pillage. Trying to get back into focus here. We're going to let Tim do that. Trying to get back into focus here in this Bible study. So it's kind of interesting in a story in which one might think could be interpreted as legitimating working within the system, right? Use mammon to rebuild social relations. You can imagine how that might be used and will be used this coming Sunday to justify the mammon system. Jesus concludes the teaching with an unequivocal statement of their opposition so that we don't go there, so that we don't misinterpret. Because indeed the whole narrative of the whole Bible is basically the archetypal struggle between the economy of manna, the great economy, Sabbath economics, and the mammon economy. And, or as Wendell Berry puts it simply, if we do not serve what coheres and endures, then we serve what disintegrates and destroys. That's the truth. And then within that truth, we have to figure out how to subvert the system that we're stuck in for the minute. I love the epilogue to this story. The lovers of money heard all of this and ridiculed him. No kidding. Of course they did. Because this is no simple or obvious thing that Jesus has challenged us to do in this story parable. In fact, in the world of mammon, capital is used all the time to destroy social relations. That's the meaning of globalization, in which capital can move freely across borders, but desperate workers cannot. It's the meaning of redeveloping neighborhoods for the rich while driving out the poor. It's the meaning of a government policy that bails out bankers who made predatory, toxic loans but not working class people who lost their homes through foreclosure on those same loans. In our economy, we sacrifice social relations to accumulate money. That's why we call it capitalism. To get money, we work too much to nurture family. We leave beloved home places to follow promotion. We're too busy to sustain friendships or community. It's why we care more about our net worth than we do about those who are marginalized. This parable is inviting us to become defective. That's a intentional double entendre, to defect from the system, to figure out how to subvert it, and thereby to become truly defective from the point of view of the mammon system. So now I want to end this by coming back to not so much social analysis, but analysis of our practices as economic producers, consumers. Let's start with a theological reflection on money. So let's talk about money for a minute. We all use it. The dominant culture that we live in would persuade us that money is simply a rational means of exchange. But of course, our experience suggests that the culture around money is hardly rational. It's fraught with anxiety, with alienation, and with addiction, huge silences. We worry incessantly about it. Similarly, capitalism contends that money is morally neutral. So make a lot of money, but be a good guy. If that were the fact, however, money wouldn't be so much an extension of our race and class disparities. Private ownership and entitlement render money morally loaded. That's why we aspire upwards and scapegoat downwards. Money manipulates, money oppresses, money kills. So it's hardly morally neutral. Biblically speaking, money is part of the mammon system. Jesus is clear about that. We ought to be also. That's why this parable, it seems to me, suggests that money can only be redeemed in this filthy, rotten system as a means by which we are rebuilding social relationships. We don't always think we have a choice with how we use our money. But the fact is, it's really poor people who don't have a choice. Those of us who have some social mobility, we have means, we have choices. The question is, do we exercise those choices? So every decision we make about how, where we spend or invest, each dollar is a question of relationships and values. So for people of faith and values, the question of what our capital, what our money is doing and who it's doing it with have to conform to the demands of social justice, not to the norms of high yield or financial return. And that's why one of the things we spend a lot of time doing here in our Sabbath economics work is working with organizations that do things like micro-financing around the world, making a little bit of capital available to poor people, which often is the difference between life and death, with community development investment institutions, banking institutions, groups such as Oiko Credit, almost 40 years old now as an ecumenical agency doing micro-lending around the world, or community credit unions that are trying to build affordable housing. These are the kinds of things that folks who have a certain amount of capital ought to be moving their capital towards. These things are not the answer. They're not the kingdom of God. They're relatively small measures in the mammon system, but they do mean a lot to poor folk. And no step, as we say in our Sabbath economics work, is too small, and no step is too big in our journey to defect from capital to community. Now, of course, a lot of us don't have investment capital. We don't have a lot of surplus capital, although I would argue most of us have a little something something. You know, we got a few $100 tucked under the pillow, have a few $1,000 in the bank. The question is, what do we do with that? Do we bank? How many of us don't use commercial banks, corporate banks? And we all, whether or not we have a little something something stowed away, we all use money all the time. It's food, it's clothes, it's cars, it's homes, it's a little bit of charitable work we do. So the question we have to ask with every use of our money is, are we only using our money to maximize our private interests or for personal or group gratification, right, to feed our appetites, or is it in every exchange part of building a social relationship with goods and services? This is the question we can ask ourselves and have to ask ourselves every single day. And that is what I would argue a discipleship of the defective steward in a middle-class first world context. Every decision about how and where we spend our dollars should be predicated upon relationships and values and building those things. So to be defective stewards, we have to ask all sorts of questions about how our use of money builds a relational ethos. Do we need it, or do we just desire it? That's a matter of a relationship to our own soul. What is the ecological impact of extracting resources and getting products to market? That's a matter of our relationship to the earth. What about the working conditions, including living wage, of those producing the goods we consume? That's relationship to workers. Relationship to equitability and social justice. Relationship to producers, distributors, retailers, to the local, regional, and international networks they represent for good and ill. Our relationship to the marketplace. Obviously, our relationship to the future in terms of sustainability. These are the kinds of questions we need to ask. Now, I'm well aware that most of us on this webinar are asking these kinds of questions. The question is, how rigorous are we? How much are we doing it communally? How much is our model of church centered around the daily, weekly wrestling with these sorts of choices? I believe the parable of the defective manager invites us all in little ways and big ways to figure out how relationships and values can be the glue for society, democracy, and for the church, given the two economies that coexist in our world. Our discipleship has to be fundamentally organized around the work of subverting capital in ways that will serve community. So obviously here at BCM, as you all know, and Jonathan Cornford down in Australia, we're trying to develop a model around practices, specific practices, always figuring out what the next step is in terms of surplus capital or debt, giving, in terms of what our ecological footprint is, our consumption, our solidarity with marginalized people, how we work and how we rest. We continue to commend this work, and we ourselves, all of us on this webinar, need to be about commending this work to the church as a whole. This is one of the ways in which it makes sense to be church. So I want to just pause here for a minute. We've been going at this Bible study here for over an hour, and have some of you reflect on issues, challenges, questions you have. That's the chat function. We invite you to be chatting away with some questions that you have. And we're going to give you a minute or two to do that. While you're madly chatting questions or comments into the chat box, and I'm going to ask Tim to kind of keep his eye and moderate them, I want to remind us of the epilogue to the story of the defective manager. If if the moral of this story is we got to figure out how to be building a new world even in the shell of the old, that's how the great Dorothy Day put it. What's the consequence of not working that way? What is the consequence of just going with the flow and not practicing Sabbath economics as rigorously as we possibly can? Well, that comes up in the lectionary for a week from Sunday. The 19th century, the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, September 29th, has two texts which are ought to get our attention as a follow-up to this Sunday's parable. One of them is the famous words of 1 Timothy 6. These are the well-known words that all of us who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by senseless and harmful desires that do actually destroy people. For the love of money is a root of all evil. And in our eagerness or anxiety to be rich, so many have wandered away from the faith and made it so painful. Boy, I'd love to hear some people preach on that text in a way that doesn't justify wealth as being about our attitude toward our money, but actually anchors it to the cosmology that does exist in the Bible of Sabbath economics. Because if you think you can twist this text, you'll have to wrestle with the gospel text for a week from Sunday, and that is the warning tale of the rich man and Lazarus. And in that text, as you know, it would be great to try to get into it. In some ways, that text preaches itself or interprets itself. It's very clear that the two economies, the two worlds of the poor, are cheek by jowl in the mammon system, represented by Dives and Lazarus. And that parable is all about the fact that that gulf between rich and poor, if we don't work to deconstruct it in our world, then we will both live and die by it. And this is truly one of the texts of terror in the Bible. In fact, it ends up with a remarkable moral of the tale. You remember that Dives tries to get Father Abraham to tell his relatives about the hell that Dives is in. And Abraham says, well, tell them to read Moses and the prophets. And Dives says, no, he says, but if you send someone from the dead to them, they'll believe that. And Luke's parable ends with the words, if we don't hear Moses and the prophets, we will not be convinced even if someone should rise from the dead. It's a very powerful Christian statement. Resurrection faith doesn't rescue us from the ultimatums of Sabbath economics. So, that's kind of a sobering note to end on. That's the logic of Luke 16. And let's see what we got here.
I can read some if you want.
Yeah. Why don't you turn on your mic and do that, Tim?
I think I can pick up here. So John McKinnon writes, to what extent is Jesus contrasting the Jubilee actions of the manager for self-interest with the Jews' lack of Jubilee actions, particularly in the light of the self-righteous elder brother in the prodigal son parable in the previous chapter?
Great insight. I think you nailed it. You said it. That's one of the advantages of reading these texts whole, because all throughout Luke's building a case, and to put these parables in consecutive order certainly is trying to make a case about ideologies of entitlement and insularity. Thank you. That's a great insight.
Jonathan Cornford says, hi, Ched, the word mammon is often talked of as having idolatrous connotations. Do you agree? Can you fill this out?
Yeah, it's a fascinating etymology, Jonathan, and it's a little obscure. Nobody really knows the origins of the term. It appears in the rabbis. Seems to be an Aramaic term that is used. It's always a derogatory term in the rabbis, but the etymology, some people think it goes back to the Babylonian phrase manman, which was sort of a dark god of death back in the ancient Babylonian world. So there could be connections to the notion of this spirit, this dark spiritual power. And so I think we are well within our theological grounds, Jonathan, to simply conclude that mammon is not a morally neutral or rational tool to be used by people for good, as long as they don't love it too much, which is the homily we'll hear in a couple of weeks around 1 Timothy 6. Rather, mammon is predatory and lethal. It is a principality and power. And yet it's a principality and power that rules our world, and we all are to some extent stuck with it. And therefore, how can we be shrewd enough to subvert it in order to try to rebuild and repair and preserve some community? Thank you.
So going in order here.
Loud, Tim, so they can hear you.
Yeah, so I think I've turned on my mic here. Portland crew was asking for that. Let me know. I can't hear my own mic, so if that's not working, let me know. So Andrew Macaleod observes there's a lack of systemic alternatives like those found in North Italy or Basque Country. He's pasted in a URL down there at the bottom to the Mondragon Corporation. We'll go with John's got a second question there. We'll come back to that. Robert Gonzalez comments, you use the word recover to describe the formation of communities and relations. Do you use that because you see a primitive model for this, or could you favor a more make it up as we go along, for lack of a more technical term, model that disrupts what is, has been, making spaces and what new relationships beyond what seems presently historically possible?
Yeah. Those two comments by Robert and Andrew are related, but let me address Andrew's first. I want to draw the attention of everybody on this webinar to the work of Andrew Macleod. And I hope you've got your book up there. Andrew, if you don't, make sure to put it up there. Andrew is a very active builder of the modern cooperative movement. He's deeply literate in the history of that movement. He's working here in California, in Northern California, with an organization that promotes and resources cooperative experiments right here in the Ojai Valley. I'm part of the Ojai Valley Green Coalition, and we are currently working with a budding food cooperative that is going to Andrew's organization for technical advice as they try to figure out how to structure themselves as a cooperative. There is a whole tradition of cooperative economics that, of course, has deep roots in older ways of relational economic exchange, but which have been experimented with, whether that's by the Mondragon experiment in Spain or modern cooperative movement. I really want you to know about Andrew's work, and Andrew, I hope you're putting your book, a link to your book up there. Andrew is a Presbyterian who's done some theological reflection on the cooperative movement. The title of his book is called Holy Cooperative. It's a great piece. Andrew was at our institute in February, and he's just doing great work. And so if you're interested in that, be sure and track down all of the links that he's putting up. It's really sort of a hidden gem. It is a classic example of an alternative economic institution within the belly of the beast that's trying to function in a market-dominant economy according to alternative values. And these economies, in many ways, are doing magnificent things, rebuilding communities, and even surviving in the market economy. And most of us don't hear about them. So do pay attention to modern cooperatives as a very concrete expression institutionally of defective economics in the spirit of what we're talking about tonight. So thanks, Andrew, for being on tonight. And I just cannot commend to everybody else on the webinar more heartfelt Andrew's work. Robert, you're asking a deeper question, really about economic anthropology and the nature of community. And I guess to make a longer story short, I want to say yes to both your suggestions. That is, in my opinion, we are hardwired by older ways of being social and relational and economic together. 99% of human history on the planet has been characterized by mutual aid, cooperative work, relational exchange, and it's really only a few hundred years that we are in the midst of being re-engineered by market culture and market practices. So the good news is that we still have some genetic material in us that actually knows how to be cooperative and knows how to be relational and longs for that. At the same time, those skills and competences and even consciousness is being atrophied by market culture, competitive culture, privatizing culture. And so that's where we can't just rely on older forms. We also have to be improvisational and creative in figuring out newer forms, hybrid forms. And I think that's probably what you're getting at. The Occupy movement has done a lot of thinking and experimenting around what some of those hybrid forms might be. So I think we have to remember and rehabilitate many of the older ways of being, while at the same time figuring out how to do that in postmodernity. This came to our institute in February, and it's a kind of an interesting example. One of the examples of that is the internet. The internet was invented by geeks, and most of the geeks who were involved in the invention of the internet, including my older brother, and may or may not be Al Gore, were people who were fascinated by the potential for the internet to be a gift economy, where people would post stuff and other people would take stuff, and it wouldn't be mediated by commercial relations. What we see today, after 20 years plus of the internet, is the attempts by commercialization, monetization, privatization of the goods and services offered on the internet. There's an attempt to sort of colonize the internet. But there's still vast amounts of gift economy on the internet. Tim Nafziger here is particularly literate in a lot of that stuff, such as freeware that you can download, open sourceware. So that's a kind of an interesting example of hybrid gift economy in the midst of a very market-pressured modern technology. What else we got, Timo?
So Susan Spicer says, just a comment, I wonder if the eternal tense suggests that wilderness place where community and faithfulness and God's provision are the means of life. You mentioned the look back to Jewish tradition, but I wonder how the two economies in light of this square with the emphasis on faithfulness and prosperity.
Not quite sure about what you mean by the last comment, but I certainly agree with you that, yes, in my opinion, I'm kind of a Bible geek, so details in the text fascinate me and move me, and I think it's very significant that the lesson that is spun in the parable of the defective manager, which hopes for distributing wealth in order to be welcomed into people's homes is then projected into a large cosmic canvas by Jesus' teaching, in which he says, do this as a way of life in the hope that we will be received into eternal tense. That's a very eschatological idea, eternal tense, but why tense, right? And I think, I do think that there are the fingerprints of the wilderness tradition there. I think that is part of the consciousness of the old tradition of what it meant to be human in as the tribes of Yahweh in the tribal confederacy of the origins of the people. So in one phrase, Jesus is pointing forward to the eschatological and backward to the old way in which Israel dwelled in tents. And that's a way of making a very big historic statement about this struggle. This struggle to defect is as old as ancient Israel and as modern as Andrew's attempts to build cooperatives. And this parable means to recruit us in no uncertain terms into that struggle as a way of life, as our discipleship. And that's why I love this parable, as weird as it seems. It really speaks to our condition, as Quakers would say. We got time for one or two more, and then we'll let particularly all our dear friends on the East Coast go to bed. While I note that, and Tim finds one or two more comments, I do want to just say to our East Coast friends, we're only aware that we're keeping you up late on these things. We are wrestling with whether we should change the times or do more than one set of these kinds of things to make it a more reasonable time zone. Please feel free to email us with your feedback about what you think about that, because we are really looking to hear you on that. Tim?
Audrey in Portland asks, I wonder what we, the peasants and managers, might learn about how to relate to the rich, the ones owning the property, the 1% ruling class. How are we to relate as people?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Audrey, I wish you were here in February. That's very much part of Luke's concern in his whole gospel. And there are so many stories and parables and teachings that address the crisis of wealth and poverty. But at the end of the day, Luke is interested in the liberation, salvation, redemption, even of the rich man. The parables in Luke that critique the rich are harder than any other text found in the gospel traditions. Luke is very clear in his analysis of affluenza. At the same time, the narrative of Jesus' ministry concludes with the story of Zacchaeus, in which this rich man redistributes his wealth and realizes that he too is a son of Abraham. At the end of Luke's gospel, in Luke 19, community trumps capital. And Zacchaeus is welcomed back into the community of Abraham by way of redistributing wealth. So this is not a sentimental embrace of the rich. It is a clear-eyed analysis that Luke has, but he is being part of the love of God is not to throw these people under the bus, but to invite them, and of course that means to us North Americans to invite ourselves into the liberation journey. So thank you for that question. Let's take one more, Tim.
So there's two questions. You can kind of choose which one. One is John just asked, so how do I squeeze this all into 15 minutes on a Sunday morning?
Yeah, John, I think you were the one hoping for the link to this time for you to get to preach on it. I'm not sure how to answer that question, brother. It's always the challenge of, we get these precious few minutes to proclaim the gospel, and so I just commend to you any number of the vectors that we've looked at today. This parable is kind of short, sweet, and to the point, and if you can if you can handle it rightly, you can do it in 20 minutes. I took the liberty to unpack it with social analysis before and practical matters afterwards, but it is possible to do. Jesus was certainly able to do it in short stories. We've got to learn that art as well. Problem is, it's really hard for us all to have ears to hear it because of how we've been re-engineered under the market system. We have to work harder on these stories to reclaim them as subversive. But hopefully tonight's webinar has given you some pointers. And above all, I want to commend you and all of the sisters and brothers tonight on the webinar who will be either proclaiming, preaching, studying, reading together this text this coming Sunday and the following Sunday. Luke 16 is powerful stuff, and let's not keep that light under a bushel. These are some of the most powerful, compelling tools we have to do battle with the mammon culture in our churches, and the next 2 Sundays we get a chance to do that. So by all means, go to battle with the sword of the Word of God. I want to remind you all that our next webinar is going to be in about 5.5 weeks, at the end of October, Tuesday, October 29th. We're going to go back to another fascinating interview. Laurel Dystra is a friend and colleague, an Anglican priest in British Columbia, former Catholic worker. This week, Laurel is amidst the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in Vancouver. She's a great peace and justice theologian, and this is now her 3rd book, and it's an anthology of stories and practices of death and dying within the discipleship communities. Elaine and I have a chapter in the book. Many people you know have, I think Murphy Davis has a chapter in this book, if I'm not mistaken. So this book is just out, so you can find it on the Whipfenstock website. I think Tim's putting the URL up there. If not, go to our Facebook page, it's up. And so we're doing this in celebration of All Saints. Last year, we had Susie Henderson, who I think is on the webinar tonight, over there in Toronto, talk about some of her practices of commemorating the dead. Susie is someone who's trying to learn the arts of being a death doula or a dying midwife. And Laurel is also exploring some of that, so we're going to interview her as part of our All Saints special in preparation for the All Saints Triduum. So please join us. And friends, we completely rely on word of mouth, and so next month, if you're able to come on, make an extra phone call or 2 and see if you can get a couple of friends to register and come on as well, so that we can build this thing up so it becomes sustainable for us.